Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to a world caught between silence and motion. A world where the air hums with distant trains, typewriters, and faint brass bands echoing from a war half a world away. The year is 1918, and on the surface, life feels orderly, certain, and proud. Yet beneath that calm, something unseen begins to stir, quiet as breath, steady as a clock's tick. In small towns and crowded barracks, the world's heartbeat changes without anyone noticing. So before the silence of night surrounds you, take a moment to like and subscribe, just if this brought you peace of mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The year was 1918, and the world was already exhausted. 4 years of war had drained the spirits from cities and fields alike, leaving behind a tired civilization that mistook silence for peace. Men were still dying in the trenches of Europe, and the skies above France trembled with the dull thunder of artillery. Most people believed that the worst suffering imaginable was already taking place. Few could imagine that something smaller than dust, lighter than air, was about to prove them wrong. In the middle of Kansas, far from the gunfire and the trenches, the land rolled out flat and endless, covered with frost and the quiet hum of survival. It was a place where time moved with the wind. Haskell County sat at the heart of it, a patchwork of farms, each holding a family accustomed to the rhythm of the seasons. In January of that year, a local doctor named Loring Miner began to notice something strange among his patients. Miner was no alarmist. He was the kind of small-town physician who kept handwritten notes and accepted eggs or bread when money was scarce. He knew what influenza looked like. It came and went most winters, taking a few people, inconveniencing many, and then fading like fog. But what he saw that winter was different. Strong, young adults were falling ill and dying quickly, sometimes within 2 days. Their fevers rose impossibly high. Their faces turned an eerie purplish color, and they gasped for breath as if drowning on dry land. Concerned, Miner wrote a formal warning to the U.S. Public Health Service, describing what he called an epidemic of influenza of a severe type. His letter appeared in a government bulletin and was promptly ignored. The Great War was the world's priority, and Kansas was just farmland in the middle of nowhere. No one thought history could start there, but history, as it often does, was already on the move. Many of Haskell County's young men had been drafted. They packed their duffels, said their goodbyes, and boarded trains bound for Camp Funston, a sprawling military training site within the Fort Riley complex. At any given time, more than 50,000 soldiers lived there, packed into wooden barracks that smelled of sweat, wool, and coal smoke. The air inside was thick and warm, sealed against the Kansas cold. It was, unknowingly, the perfect incubator for a respiratory virus. On March 4th, 1918, a company cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary with a fever, sore throat, and body aches. By lunchtime, more than 100 soldiers followed him in with the same symptoms. Within days, 500 were sick. The camp's hospital overflowed, and doctors began converting warehouses and hangars into makeshift wards. The illness spread so rapidly that it outpaced any attempt to track it. The military, pressed by wartime urgency, didn't slow its operations. Soldiers had to be trained, moved, and shipped to Europe. Sick or not, the machine of war could not stop. So trains left Kansas, carrying troops to other bases. Georgia, Virginia, Massachusetts, and with them the virus hitched a ride. Within weeks, influenza appeared at dozens of camps across the country. Still, no one panicked. The cases, while numerous, weren't always fatal. In most soldiers, the illness lasted 3 or 4 days and then passed. Doctors assumed it was a seasonal flu. Newspapers, kept on a short leash by wartime censorship, printed reassuring notes about a 3-day fever that was mild in character. People moved on. The soldiers kept shipping out. By the time spring turned to summer, the virus had crossed the Atlantic aboard troop transports. The crowded ships, filled with thousands of young men sleeping in stacked bunks, were ideal laboratories for infection. The men coughed, sneezed, and shared the same stale air for weeks as they sailed toward the war. The virus disembarked with them in French ports like Brest and Bordeaux, then followed them into the trenches. The world was already sick with violence, and the flu simply joined the noise. It spread rapidly among Allied and German troops alike, slipping through front lines that barbed wire couldn't block. But this first wave, as it would later be called, was deceptive. It spread easily but killed relatively few. The symptoms were unpleasant, but survivable. Fever, exhaustion, coughing, aches, most recovered within a week. Even doctors who noticed its speed didn't grasp its potential. They treated it as a nuisance, not a threat. As spring turned to summer, the flu appeared in cities far from the front: London, Paris, Bombay, Shanghai. It moved through trade routes, following ships and trains like a ghost map of commerce. By July, it had reached every continent except Antarctica. Yet, it still seemed harmless enough that few took notice. Compared with the war, it was a quiet problem. And quiet problems rarely make headlines. But viruses don't sleep. In the crowded port cities of northern France, something was changing. The virus, already mutating as it moved from body to body, began to evolve into a more efficient killer. Soldiers packed into transit camps provided the perfect environment, stressed, underfed, and constantly mingling. Each infection offered the virus a new experiment, a new genetic trial. Most mutations failed. A few succeeded. The result was a strain so lethal it seemed almost designed for destruction. By August, the new strain appeared nearly simultaneously in 3 places: Brest in France, Boston in the United States, and Freetown in Sierra Leone. Each outbreak followed the same horrifying pattern. People felt fine in the morning, feverish by afternoon, and dead by nightfall. Their skin turned blue-black from lack of oxygen, their lungs filled with frothy fluid, and their bodies suffocated from within. Doctors, stunned, called it purple death. In Boston, the disease began among sailors at the Commonwealth Pier. Within days, it swept through the nearby naval hospital and into the city. Doctors and nurses worked until they collapsed. By the end of September, the flu had spread to every major city on the East Coast. Philadelphia, busy with its wartime shipyards, ignored early warnings from physicians who begged for public closures. On September 8, the city held a massive parade to promote war bonds. 200,000 people lined the streets. Within 72 hours, hospitals were full. Within a week, corpses filled the streets, awaiting pickup by horse-drawn carts. Funeral homes ran out of coffins, and gravediggers couldn't keep up. Entire families died within days of each other. The city imposed quarantine orders far too late. By October, more than 12,000 Philadelphians were dead. The same scenes unfolded everywhere: Chicago, San Francisco, London, Calcutta, Cape Town. The pandemic did not discriminate. It crossed every border, every ocean. In the trenches, the sick collapsed next to the dying. On ships, entire crews were incapacitated mid-voyage. In some coastal towns, so many people were sick that no one remained strong enough to bury the dead. Doctors, desperate, tried everything: quinine, strychnine, even massive doses of aspirin, which sometimes worsened the bleeding in patients' lungs. They recommended bed rest, clean air, and prayers. None of it made much difference. There were no antivirals, no ventilators, no antibiotics for secondary infections. Medicine could only what? The only effective measures were social, closing theaters, canceling gatherings, wearing masks. Some cities acted early and saved lives. Others hesitated, afraid of economic backlash. St. Louis, for instance, shut down quickly and kept death rates relatively low. Philadelphia did not, and paid the price. The difference between life and death was timing, not technology. As autumn deepened, the world's death toll climbed beyond comprehension. In India alone, millions perished. Many cremated along the Ganges because there was no space left for burial. In Persia, perhaps a quarter of the population died. In the Pacific, entire villages vanished. The numbers were so high that governments stopped counting. By November, even as the armistice ended the Great War, the virus raged on. Crowds celebrated in the streets, hugging soldiers and strangers alike, and the flu spread one last time in a wave of joy and relief. The bells of peace rang over the sound of coughing. For some, the flu was a tragedy. For others, it was a blur, a fevered few days that passed. For everyone, it was unforgettable. And yet, within a decade, the world would begin to forget. The second wave faded as winter began. Deaths decreased. Hospitals emptied. Families tried to rebuild their lives. The pandemic had killed at least 50 million people, possibly twice that. But when it finally loosened its grip, humanity did what it always does after catastrophe. It looked away. The silence that followed would become its own kind of legacy. When the coughing finally stopped echoing through the cities, an eerie hush settled over the world. It wasn't peace exactly, just a long collective exhale. The armistice had come, soldiers were coming home, and the newspapers once again had something hopeful to print. For a few precious months, everyone wanted to believe that the worst was over. They closed the curtains on 4 years of war and 1 year of pestilence, pretending that both belonged to the same nightmare. But the virus wasn't quite finished. It lingered like smoke after a fire, hidden in small embers scattered across the globe. By the beginning of 1919, a final wave began to stir. Doctors recognized the pattern immediately: fever, coughing, cyanosis. But they were too tired to raise alarm. The third wave wasn't as explosive as the second, but it was still deadly enough to sweep through communities already hollowed out by grief. In Australia, which had mostly escaped the earlier devastation through strict maritime quarantine, the new year brought an unwelcome surprise. Returning soldiers carried the flu ashore, and it spread across the continent in a matter of weeks. Entire towns locked down again, schools closed, public gatherings were banned, and the familiar mask mandates returned. The measures worked to some extent, but the weariness was palpable. People followed the rules without conviction, the way you do when you're obeying out of habit rather than hope. In the United States, exhaustion was just as visible. Cities that had been strict in the fall now hesitated to reimpose restrictions. The public had had enough of closures, enough of the smell of disinfectant and the sight of gauze masks. In San Francisco, when officials reinstated a mask order in early 1919, residents erupted in protest. The newly formed anti-mask league held public meetings, arguing that the law was an infringement on personal liberty. One woman famously refused to wear hers even in court, where she was fined and escorted out. Her defiance became a small symbol of how frayed everyone's nerves had become. Meanwhile, the Paris Peace Conference convened to carve up the remains of the war. Inside the ornate halls, diplomats argued over borders and reparations, while outside the city, the flu made its quiet rounds again. Even President Woodrow Wilson fell ill. His symptoms suspiciously liked those of influenza, fever, coughing, confusion. Officially, his aides called it a cold. Unofficially, it was the third wave reaching into the corridors of power. Wilson recovered, but witnesses said he returned changed, more irritable, less flexible, and unusually paranoid during the negotiations. Some historians later wondered if the fever clouded his judgment and influenced the harsh terms imposed on Germany. If so, then even the peace treaty that ended the Great War carried the virus's invisible fingerprints. By the summer of 1919, the pandemic was fading for real. There was no single day of victory, no official declaration that it was over. It simply burned itself out. Too many had already been infected, and those who survived carried some level of immunity. Like a fire that had consumed all its fuel, the virus sputtered into silence. When the counting finally began, the numbers didn't make sense. At least 50 million dead, possibly as many as 100 million, roughly 1 out of every 20 people on Earth, more than the total killed by 4 years of World War. In India alone, as many as 20 million people died, many cremated, along the banks of the Ganges, where funeral fires burned day and night until the wood ran out. In Persia, now Iran, up to a quarter of the population perished. In Alaska and northern Canada, entire indigenous villages vanished, the few survivors found days later by supply ships that came too late. The losses were staggering not just in quantity, but in quality. The 1918 influenza had cut down the young and healthy. The farmers, the teachers, the nurses, the soldiers. Families were left with the very old and the very young, a hollowed-out middle. In some communities, the number of orphans tripled. Census charts for the 1920s show a strange dip in the population between ages 20 and 40. A demographic scar left by the pandemic's peculiar cruelty. Yet, even with its enormity, the memory of the pandemic began fading almost immediately. There were no memorials for the victims, no national days of mourning. In part, it was timing. The war had already consumed the world's grief quota. People were eager to rebuild, to move forward, to celebrate survival rather than dwell on loss. Newspapers that had once printed pages of obituaries returned to covering sports, politics, and cinema. Theaters reopened, dance halls filled, and jazz drifted through city nights that had been silent for too long. Psychologists would later call it collective amnesia. In truth, it was simple fatigue. People were tired of fear. They had lost enough and wanted to forget the rest. The pandemic became a family story, told in fragments. An aunt who died of the grip, a grandfather who barely pulled through. It slipped quietly out of history books and into private memory. But science didn't forget. Doctors and researchers, stunned by their own helplessness during the crisis, vowed to understand what had happened. The field of epidemiology, still young in 1918, began to grow. Governments, established national health ministries. In 1923, the League of Nations created its health organization, an early version of what would later become the World Health Organization. The experience of the flu convinced even the most skeptical politicians the disease could cripple nations as surely as war. For medicine, the pandemic had been a humiliation. Despite all the progress of the 19th century, the discovery of germs, antiseptics, and vaccines for smallpox, doctors had been powerless against an invisible enemy they couldn't even see under their microscope. The influenza virus was too small, too elusive. It wouldn't be identified until the 1930s, when new technology made it visible. In 1918, physicians thought bacteria were to blame. They worked tirelessly to isolate a culprit under the microscope, misidentifying a harmless microbe called Haemophilus influenzae as the cause. It wasn't until decades later that scientists realized the truth. They had been chasing a shadow. The lessons of 1918 were many, but most of them had to be learned twice. The importance of clear communication, the danger of denial, the need for transparency between nations. Wartime censorship had made things worse, not better. Governments that hid the flu to preserve morale ended up with more deaths and less trust. Spain, neutral and free from wartime press controls, reported openly on its outbreaks. For this honesty, the world repaid it with an unfair nickname, the Spanish flu. It was a small, ironic punishment for telling the truth. As the 1920s unfolded, the world moved on. The rhythm of industry, fashion, and music drowned out the ghosts. New words replaced old fears: radio, automobile, jazz. The people who had lost everything in 1918 built new lives because there was no other choice. The dead were not forgotten, but they were quietly set aside, tucked into photographs and unspoken memories. The modern world wanted speed, not reflection. Still, in laboratories and hospitals, the shadow of 1918 lingered. Each winter brought reminders, seasonal influenza outbreaks that were milder, but related distant cousins of the same viral lineage. Scientists began cataloging the patterns, charting the rises and falls of illness like tides. They didn't yet know that the 1918 virus hadn't vanished at all. It had simply mutated into a less deadly form and was still circulating year after year, quietly training the immune systems of those who survived. Even in its quiet phase, the virus was never entirely done with humanity. It had written itself into our biology and our history, waiting patiently for someone to rediscover its story. The rediscovery would come decades later, far from Kansas and the trenches, in places where the ground never thawed and memory was locked beneath ice. But for now, the world was content to forget. The story slipped beneath the noise of the roaring 20s, hidden under laughter, neon lights, and the illusion that progress had triumphed over nature. Of course, nature was simply catching its breath. The forgetting came quietly, which was fitting for a pandemic that had always moved in silence. By the early 1920s, the Spanish flu had already begun dissolving from public memory, and the world seemed almost eager to assist the erasure. The great cities were being rebuilt, industries restarted, and the clamor of post-war optimism drowned out what little was left of mourning. The empty chairs at dinner tables stayed empty, but no one lingered on them for long. Life, as it always does, rearranged itself around the absences. What made the forgetting so effortless wasn't conspiracy or denial, it was exhaustion. After 4 years of war and 2 years of disease, Humanity had nothing left to process trauma. The roaring 20s were, in a sense, a kind of manic laughter after the funeral. People wanted motion, noise, and novelty. Jazz records spun in bars. Automobiles filled the streets. There were new dances, new slang, new technologies, all promising that the future would never again look backward. The pandemic, with its images of masks, mass graves, and silent parades, belonged to a past no one wished to revisit. In most countries, there were no monuments to the victims. There were memorials for soldiers, of course, grand statues and solemn marches, but not for the millions who died in their beds or on the sidewalks of their towns. Their deaths were considered private tragedies, not public sacrifices. Historians later called it the Great Forgetting. Even medical journals wrote about it sparingly, as if embarrassed by how little had been understood at the time. The 1918 influenza had killed more people than any war in human history, yet within a decade it was a ghost in conversation, a topic too grim for polite company. But for doctors and scientists, forgetting wasn't an option. The experience of helplessness in 1918 had left a deep scar on the medical profession. The best physicians in the world had watched people die with nothing to offer but water and prayer. They had applied every known treatment: quinine, strychnine, morphine, whiskey, and heroic doses of aspirin, and none of it had mattered. They couldn't even identify what had caused the illness. Microscopes of the era couldn't see viruses, and the field of virology barely existed. The mysterious filterable agents, as they were called, were still theoretical. That uncertainty fueled decades of curiosity. In the 1930s, scientists finally isolated the influenza virus, proving it wasn't bacterial at all, but a new type of microorganism, one that could only reproduce inside living cells. It was a revelation, but a bittersweet one. Knowing the enemy's name didn't yet mean knowing how to fight it. Vaccines and antivirals were still a long way off. Still, each small discovery brought medicine closer to understanding what had happened in 1918. Governments, too, had learned painful lessons. The pandemic had shown that disease could destabilize nations as easily as war. When the League of Nations was founded in 1919, one of its earliest branches was the Health Organization, a modest office tasked with sharing information about outbreaks, collecting data, and promoting sanitation. It was a bureaucratic seed that would eventually grow into the World Health Organization after the Second World War. Public health had become an international concern, and the ghost of 1918 was its unspoken inspiration. At the same time, something stranger was happening to the virus itself. It didn't vanish after 1919. Instead, it adapted, softening its edges and blending into the background of seasonal influenza. Scientists would later discover that the H1N1 strain responsible for the pandemic continued to circulate for decades, evolving and exchanging genetic material with other strains. Each winter's flu was, in a sense, a diluted echo of 1918. The deadliest virus of the modern age hadn't died out, it had simply learned to coexist. In the 1950s, another generation of scientists began tracing those viral lineages with growing fascination. By then, the world had seen new pandemics, the so-called Asian flu of 1957 and the Hong Kong flu of 1968, but nothing like the scale of 1918. Antibiotics now existed to treat secondary infections, and public health systems were far better organized. Still, the comparisons were inevitable. Every new outbreak brought back whispers of the old flu, that dark chapter most people's grandparents never talked about. One man who hadn't forgotten was Johann Holtin, a Swedish-born pathologist studying at the University of Iowa. In 1951, Hultin became obsessed with a question that had haunted medical science for decades. Could the 1918 virus still exist somewhere? Preserved in nature, he reasoned that if bodies had been buried in permafrost, ground so cold it never thaws, perhaps the virus had survived in frozen lung tissue. The idea sounded far-fetched, almost gothic, but Hultin decided to test it anyway. He traveled to a remote Inuit village in Alaska called Brevig Mission, where 72 of the 80 residents had died within 5 days during the pandemic. The victims had been buried in a mass grave on a small hill overlooking the sea. With permission from the village elders, Hultin and a small team began digging. The work was slow and surreal. Hours of chipping through frozen soil under the pale Arctic sun. When they finally reached the wooden coffins, they found that the permafrost had preserved the bodies astonishingly well. Hultin carefully collected lung samples from several victims, sealed them in containers, and brought them back to Iowa. His hope was to culture the virus, to coax it back to life in a laboratory setting. It didn't work. The samples were too degraded, the techniques too crude. He published his results, filed his notes, and moved on. For half a century, his expedition became little more than a scientific footnote, an earnest failure remembered by a handful of colleagues. But the story didn't end there. Decades later, in the 1990s, a new generation of scientists picked up where Hultin had left off. Molecular genetics had advanced beyond imagination. Researchers could now extract fragments of RNA from old tissue and read the sequences like a biological code. At the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, D.C., a virologist named Jeffrey Taubenberger began examining autopsy samples from soldiers who had died in 1918. Many of those samples had been preserved in paraffin blocks for archival study. They were fragile, yellowed, and nearly forgotten. Piece by piece, Taubenberger and his team began reconstructing the viral genome. It was like assembling a novel from confetti, hundreds of tiny fragments of text that had to be arranged in the right order. It took years of painstaking work. Then, one day, a retired pathologist in California read about Taubenberger's project in a scientific journal. His name was Johann Hultin. He was in his 70s now, but he remembered the mass grave at Brevig Mission as clearly as if he had visited yesterday. He wrote to Taubenberger, offering to return to Alaska and retrieve new samples. In 1997, nearly 50 years after his first expedition, Hultin went back. The village elders remembered him and granted permission again. He and a small team began digging in the same frozen hill. After several days, they uncovered the body of a woman whose internal organs had been remarkably preserved by cold and her own insulating body fat. Hultin named her Lucy. He removed tissue samples from her lungs, sealed them carefully, and shipped them to Taubenberger's lab. 10 days later, the results came in. The RNA of the 1918 influenza was present and intact. It was the discovery scientists had been chasing for almost 80 years. Using those samples, researchers were able to reconstruct the full genetic code of the 1918 virus. The sequence revealed that it had originated from birds, not pigs, as long believed, and that its structure allowed it to infect humans directly. It was an H1N1 subtype, a designation that would sound eerily familiar decades later when its descendants resurfaced in modern pandemics. The completed sequence confirmed something else too. The 1918 virus was unlike anything seen before or since. It had evolved in a perfect storm of biological opportunity, fast enough to spread, deadly enough to kill, and novel enough to bypass human immunity entirely. It wasn't supernatural, just efficient. Nature's cruelest trick is rarely malice, it's precision. When the study was published in 2005, the world's press called it a resurrection. In truth, it was more like decoding a fossil. The virus wasn't alive, but its blueprint was. And from that blueprint came both knowledge and unease. Scientists could now identify the genetic markers that made the 1918 strain so deadly. They could also recognize those same mutations when they appeared in other viruses. In theory, that made humanity safe. In practice, it was a reminder that we were still playing the same game, just with better microscopes. The ghost of 1918 had been unearthed, examined, and catalogued, but it had never really been buried. When scientists finally held the entire genetic sequence of the 1918 virus in their hands, it felt like a victory, though one shadowed by unease. The work had taken nearly a century of persistence, failed experiments, and chance discoveries buried in ice. But now that the sequence existed, so did the question: what should humanity do with it? To understand a killer is noble. To rebuild one, less so. In 2005, when researchers published the genome, debate broke out quietly among scientists and loudly among ethicists. Some argued that recreating the virus in controlled laboratory conditions could help prepare for future pandemics, allowing scientists to test vaccines and antiviral drugs against a resurrected foe. Others warned that the act of resurrection itself bordered on hubris, a kind of biological necromancy that risked repeating old mistakes. The strain, after all, was classified as a biosafety level 4 pathogen, the highest level of danger known. It could only be handled in laboratories sealed tighter than bank vaults, where air was filtered twice before it left the room. Yet curiosity prevailed, as it usually does. For a few brief weeks in that secure environment, the 1918 virus lived again, not in people, but in the lungs of lab animals. The scientists watched through glass as it did exactly what it had done almost a century earlier: replicate rapidly, damage tissue, and trigger an overwhelming immune response. Even mice and ferrets, the standard test subjects, developed the same fatal inflammation seen in human victims. The researchers shut everything down and destroyed the samples after confirming their suspicions. The virus's lethality came not from a single mutation, but from an intricate balance of them. It was evolution's equivalent of a perfect storm. Still, the knowledge gained was invaluable. The reconstructed virus explained what had puzzled doctors for generations: why healthy young adults had been its primary victims. Their immune systems, strong and unaccustomed to this new invader, had overreacted violently, releasing cascades of inflammation that destroyed their own lungs. In essence, the body had killed itself defending itself. The virus had simply been the spark. That spark still smoldered in nature. Variants of H1N1 continued circulating in animals and humans, mutating as all influenza viruses do. Most were benign, a nuisance that filled pharmacies with cough syrup every winter, but some combinations were more dangerous. In 1957, a new H2N2 strain emerged in East Asia and spread rapidly worldwide, killing over 1 million people. In 1968, another reshuffled strain, H3N2, did the same. Scientists noted that while those later pandemics were milder, they followed eerily familiar patterns: sudden emergence, global spread within months, and a death toll that landed unevenly across continents. Each time, the medical infrastructure of the world responded faster. Vaccines were developed within months instead of years. Antibiotics reduced deaths from pneumonia. the common secondary infection that had killed so many in 1918. But the virus always stayed one step ahead, mutating just enough to keep humanity guessing. Influenza's great advantage was its unpredictability. It could reinvent itself endlessly, trading genes with its cousins in birds and pigs, reshuffling its molecular deck like a gambler who never tires of the game. By the 1970s, one of those older strains, the direct descendant of the 1918 virus, mysteriously disappeared from human circulation. Then in 1977, it returned, almost unchained. Scientists were baffled. The genetic profile of the reappearing H1N1 strain looked nearly identical to samples frozen in the 1950s, as though someone had accidentally or deliberately released it from a laboratory freezer. The reemergence was mild, but unsettling. The past had a way of leaking back into the present, molecule by molecule. Meanwhile, society's memory of 1918 had begun to thaw as well. The rediscovery of the virus's genome reignited public fascination. Documentaries, books, and studies appeared in rapid succession, framing the pandemic as both tragedy and warning. For decades, it had been a footnote in history. Now it was being studied like scripture. Epidemiologists called it the mother of all pandemics, not out of melodrama, but because every major flu strain since had descended from it in some way. The virus's genetic fingerprints were everywhere, from the mildest colds to the most virulent outbreaks. Still, for all the renewed interest, the emotional distance remained. People could talk about 1918 clinically, academically, even cinematically, but few truly felt it. The black and white photographs of masked nurses and horse-drawn hares looked quaint, almost theatrical, to modern eyes. The world had grown accustomed to the idea that science could contain anything, that assumption would hold until it didn't. In 2009, the H1N1 virus returned once more, this time in a form popularly dubbed swine flu. It was less deadly than its infamous ancestor, but spread astonishingly fast. Airports became checkpoints, schools closed, and once again face masks reappeared on the streets. For a few uneasy months, the rhythm of 1918 replayed itself, though in slow motion. Governments issued calm statements, scientists held daily briefings, and the public watched graphs of infection curves like stock tickers. The outbreak ultimately killed hundreds of thousands, not tens of millions, a difference owed largely to vaccines, antibiotics, and international coordination. But it was enough to remind the world that the story wasn't over. Each new pandemic brings with it a strange kind of déjà vu. The words change, quarantine becomes lockdown, telegrams become tweets, but the choreography stays the same. Denial, fear, improvisation, blame, fatigue, the same debates about masks, personal freedom, and public responsibility echo across decades. In that sense, 1918 never truly ended. It simply became the template. Medical historians sometimes describe pandemics as mirrors. They don't just reveal pathogens. They reveal societies, their strengths, their weaknesses, their priorities. In 1918, the mirror showed a world too distracted by war to notice its own vulnerability. In 2009, it reflected a world that believed technology alone could save it. Both times, the virus exploited human behavior as much as biology. And so, when the 21st century faced yet another global outbreak, this one far deadlier in reach, though milder in proportion, the comparisons returned again. People dusted off the old headlines about mask ordinances and public fatigue. Historians revisited reports from the 1918 Anti-Mask League and found the same tone of exasperated defiance. The only difference was the medium. Outrage had gone digital. Even a century later, the same ancient patterns of resistance and exhaustion played out, only faster, louder, and streamed in high definition. But to understand those echoes, you have to return to what made the 1918 flu different, not just its death toll, but its silence afterward. The generations that lived through it rarely spoke of it. Grandparents who described the Great Depression or the war with vivid detail would pass over 1918 with a single line: that was when everyone got sick. The trauma was too large to fit into stories. You could narrate a battle, but not an empty street filled with the smell of disinfectant and the sound of coughing. Some historians think that silence shaped the modern world more deeply than we realize. The children who grew up amid that silence became the adults who built the 20th century's medical infrastructure. They were the ones who demanded clean water, vaccination programs, and hospitals that could handle mass illness. They had seen what happened when the system failed. Their silence wasn't forgetfulness. It was motivation, quietly redirected. In the cold, rational light of laboratories, the legacy of 1918 lived on as a cautionary blueprint. Every pandemic preparedness plan, every emergency stockpile, every new vaccine formula carried its genetic ghost. Even the seasonal flu shots millions take each year are, in a roundabout way, a ritual acknowledgement of that old catastrophe. Each injection is a handshake with history, an annual bargain between the living and the virus that once humbled them. The story of 1918 isn't really a story about disease. It's a story about adaptation, ours and nature's. It's about how progress coexists with fragility, how the modern world's confidence is always one mutation away from humility. Every era believes itself smarter than the last. Every era learns, eventually, that nature doesn't care. And in the quiet moments between outbreaks and news cycles, the lesson still hums under the surface. The silent killer was never just a virus. It was complacency, the belief that history doesn't repeat if you simply refuse to listen for the echo. It's strange how easily complacency returns after catastrophe. The 1918 influenza had taught governments, scientists, and ordinary citizens how fragile civilization could be. But within a few decades, the lesson blurred around the edges. Progress has a way of making people forget the conditions that created it. By the middle of the 20th century, antibiotics and vaccines had transformed medicine into something almost godlike. Polio had been tamed, smallpox was shrinking, and doctors could finally cure infections that once guaranteed death. The idea that an invisible particle of RNA could bring nations to their knees began to feel outdated, a relic of a more primitive century. The 1918 pandemic slid further into abstraction. It became a line in textbooks, a case study for epidemiologists, or a grim curiosity for historians. It rarely appeared in films or novels, and when it did, it was overshadowed by the more cinematic violence of war. The First World War had heroes and villains, uniforms and parades. The flu had none of that. It was shapeless, unphotogenic. You couldn't film a virus with a hand-cranked camera, and you couldn't write a stirring speech about washing your hands. Even so, a few scientists kept chasing the ghost. They collected data from old death certificates, mapped the spread, and built primitive models of infection curves. Their work didn't make headlines. It was dry, mathematical, and lacking the drama of trench warfare or moon landings. Yet those forgotten graphs quietly shaped the modern science of epidemiology. When the world later faced new diseases, SARS, Ebola, H1N1, those old models became the foundation for predicting how contagion travels. Every line on every chart was, in some way, an echo of 1918's chaos turned into geometry. The larger public, though, barely remembered the name. The Spanish flu sounded quaint, like a dance step or a forgotten cocktail. School children learned about the Great War and the Great Depression, but not the great pandemic sandwiched between them. It was as if the human mind could only hold two global disasters at once, and the flu drew the short straw. Families that had lost loved ones rarely spoke of it. The memory was too heavy, and there was no narrative comfort, no victory, no moral. It was just loss on a scale that defied language. But beneath the surface, the world was still rearranging itself around what 1918 had revealed. Cities expanded their public health systems. Hospitals standardized sanitation and reporting practices. Governments built the early networks that would later evolve into the World Health Organization. Even the notion of flattening the curve, the now familiar phrase used to describe slowing an outbreak, had its roots in studies of the Spanish flu. Researchers noticed that cities which imposed distancing measures early, like St. Louis, fared dramatically better than those that delayed, like Philadelphia. It was a simple lesson: act fast, even if it feels unnecessary. The problem was that acting fast rarely felt politically convenient. Through the middle decades of the 20th century, the virus itself kept changing costumes. Each new flu season was a rehearsal, each pandemic a remake. The 1957 Asian flu, the 1968 Hong Kong flu, the 2009 swine flu, all of them traced their genetic lineage back to that single strain that had once leapt from birds to humans somewhere near the end of the Great War. None were as catastrophic, but each carried fragments of the same code, a biological memory of 1918. Meanwhile, the human memory remained unreliable by the late 1990s, when Johann Holton and Jeffrey Taubenberger finally reconstructed the virus's genome. Journalists called it a resurrection, though it was more like archaeology. The discovery jolted public awareness for a moment, but then faded into the usual scientific background noise. A few documentaries aired on public television. A handful of articles warned about the dangers of lab leaks or the unpredictability of nature. Then the headlines moved on. The pattern was familiar: discovery, alarm, boredom, repetition. Humanity liked to flirt with disaster, not marry it, and yet the lessons waited quietly in archives and medical journals, ready to be rediscovered whenever the world stumbled into the same trap. When the next global pandemic arrived, a century later, the parallels with 1918 were impossible to ignore. The masks, the closures, the debates about freedom versus responsibility. It was all there, replayed with modern vocabulary and faster communication. Historians dusted off newspaper clippings from San Francisco's anti-mask league and found the same arguments, word for word, just written in fountain pen instead of pixels. The irony was that the very progress inspired by 1918 had also made people believe they were beyond such things. Technology breeds confidence, and confidence breeds risk. By the time the world once again found itself counting cases and debating mandates, the old lessons sounded almost prophetic. The details were different virus, different century, but the structure of panic was identical. People rediscovered, almost verbatim, that epidemics don't just test immune systems, they test patience, empathy, and trust. Through it all, the memory of the Spanish flu shifted from history to metaphor. Writers began invoking it as shorthand for fragility, the way people once spoke of Atlantis or Icarus. It became a story about what happens when ambition outpaces humility. The silent killer had been nature, yes, but also the human tendency to overestimate control. Even now, more than 100 years later, the numbers remain almost abstract. At least 50 million dead, possibly twice that. It's easier to think of them as data points than as people. A mother in Chicago, a dock worker in Mumbai, a teacher in Madrid. Each one a single pixel in the vast, blurred portrait of catastrophe. The scale defies visualizing. You could read one name per second for an entire week and still not finish. The silence that followed wasn't just grief. It was the sound of a species hitting the limits of comprehension. And yet, some traces endure in old cemeteries. The clusters of identical death dates, October 1918, November 1918, still tell the story. In archives, letters written in shaky handwriting mention the fever or the bad lungs. In family photo albums, there's the occasional gap, a sibling who lived only 20 years, a parent no one remembers meeting. Those absences are the real monuments, uncarved but permanent. Science continues to carry the story forward in its own quiet way. Each flu shot, given by a nurse on an ordinary Tuesday, is a small act of remembrance. Each outbreak model run on a government computer is a descendant of the charts drawn by exhausted doctors in 1918. The modern world hums with invisible memorials, data, protocols, emergency plans. The living rarely notice them, but they're there, built on lessons written in the language of loss. And perhaps that's what the story of the 1918 flu ultimately became. Not a warning shouted across centuries, but a whisper embedded in routine. The virus that once turned cities into morgues now lingers in seasonal waves that most people treat with a shrug. It's humbling in its own way to realize that the deadliest pandemic in modern history ended not with a grand finale, but with paperwork, meetings, and annual booster shots. Progress doesn't erase the past, it just folds it into policy. By the time the century turned, the pandemic had fully completed its transformation from event to echo. What had once been terror became trivia. The phrase Spanish flu now lived mostly in crossword puzzles, history lectures, and the quiet obsession of epidemiologists who could still hear its rhythm in the background noise of modern life. The silent killer, as it turned out, hadn't vanished. It had simply changed frequency, drifting below the threshold of everyday awareness. Still there, still humming, waiting for anyone who cared to listen. The story of the 1918 flu lingers not only in data but in behavior, quiet habits that most people never associate with its legacy, the obsession with hand washing, the expectation that governments release health bulletins, even the design of hospital ventilation systems. All trace their lineage to that moment when the world first realized air itself could betray you. The pandemic rewired civilization at the molecular level, embedding caution into the architecture of daily life. By the 1920s, the idea of public health had become something tangible, an institution rather than an abstract moral duty. Before 1918, illness was largely considered a private matter. Afterward, it was a matter of infrastructure. Cities began chlorinating water, monitoring sewage, and inspecting food supplies. The bureaucratic machinery that later handled vaccinations, emergency planning, and sanitation was born from the wreckage of the flu. Even the image of the doctor changed, from solitary healer to civil servant, a cog in the vast machinery of disease prevention. For all its bureaucratic origins, That shift saved millions of lives in the century that followed. Each improvement, the polio vaccine, antibiotics, sterile surgery, was built on the acknowledgement that ignorance is deadly. Yet humanity's relationship with disease remained complicated. Fear faded, confidence swelled, and soon the lessons of humility began to erode. By the mid-20th century, medicine had learned to perform miracles, and miracles tend to make people forget the reason they were needed in the first place. That forgetting came back into focus whenever the pattern repeated. In the late 1950s, the Asian flu spread through schools and factories across continents, reminding the post-war generation that prosperity did not grant immunity. 2 decades later, the Hong Kong flu repeated the lesson in a more subdued tone. Each outbreak prompted the same uneasy mix of modern pride and ancient fear. Airplanes replaced troop ships, cities replaced camps, but the rhythm of infection was unchanged. The virus didn't care about progress, it only cared about opportunity. Scientists learned to watch the virus's mutations the way meteorologists watch storm systems. The language of prediction waves, peaks, hotspots came directly from the statistical habits formed after 1918. Virology grew into a global discipline. Labs in London, Tokyo, and Atlanta began sharing samples. Influenza strains through what became known as the World Influenza Surveillance Network. Each year, the network decided which strains to include in the annual flu vaccine, a ritual of precaution rooted in century-old anxiety. There was poetry in that process. Science as memory, vaccines as tiny monuments to past mistakes. Each needle jab carried a faint echo of Kansas, Camp Funston, and the nameless doctors who had once stared helplessly at patients turning blue. Yet outside those circles of expertise, the public grew increasingly detached from the story. Pandemics were things that happened to other generations. In grainy photographs and dusty archive, most people's only interaction with influenza was a brief fever every winter and an occasional reminder to get your shot. That calm confidence, as always, was temporary. The world that 1918 had reshaped was still vulnerable to its own biology. By the early 2000s, new viruses began emerging: SARS, avian flu, MERS, each triggering a brief panic before fading back into the background noise. Governments rehearsed emergency plans written by committees that had studied 1918's failures. Some of those plans worked, others faltered, but the blueprint was the same: isolate, communicate, mitigate. The irony was that the more the world prepared, the less it believed preparation was necessary. The true legacy of the 1918 flu wasn't in the viruses that followed, but in the strange psychology it left behind, a pendulum that swung between vigilance and denial. Humanity seemed condemned to oscillate between panic and complacency, learning and forgetting in cycles. Each new outbreak reignited the same questions: how much freedom should people surrender for safety? How much truth should governments tell to avoid chaos? The answers varied, but the arguments never changed. They were inherited disputes, passed down like family heirlooms from the age of horse-drawn hearses and gauze masks. One quiet consequence of that inheritance was the rise of medical transparency. In 1918, censorship had been considered patriotic. By the 21st century, it was unthinkable. When the next pandemic arrived, news traveled at the speed of light, and fear moved even faster. The technology that once promised clarity instead amplified confusion. Rumors spread as efficiently as any virus. The lesson of 1918, that secrecy kills, had mutated into something harder to manage: the problem of too much noise. and yet the parallels remained hauntingly precise. People still argued about masks, cities still measured their responses in case counts and hospital beds, scientists still scrambled to decode genomes while politicians promised stability. The vocabulary was modern, but the script was the same. History, it seemed, was not a straight line, but a loop, a slow orbit around the same frail truths. In quieter moments, when historians revisited 1918, they often marveled not at its scale, but at its silence. The event had reshaped the 20th century more profoundly than any war, yet it left almost no monuments, no victory arches, no national holidays, no famous last words. It existed in footnotes, hospital records, and the cautious tone of public health announcements. Even the survivors rarely spoke of it. The trauma had calcified into a kind of collective restraint, as if naming it too often might summon it again. That restraint became its own inheritance, the bureaucratic calm with which governments now respond to outbreaks. The measured language, the charts, the graphs, owes more to 1918's silence than its suffering. The world learned to speak about death in numbers because words for the experience itself had failed. The abstraction was protective, a way to contain something that once defied containment. There's an almost poetic symmetry in that transformation. The pandemic that erased so many voices ended up teaching the living how to speak carefully. It gave birth to the language of risk and probability, of case rates and mortality curves. It made the world statistical, and in that statistical world, every future pandemic would unfold not as a mystery, but as a model. People would track their fear through graphs instead of funerals, and somehow that would feel like progress. But under the models and numbers, the same unease endures. The quiet awareness that everything stable depends on forces we barely understand. The air, the touch, the unseen particle floating in sunlight. The lesson of 1918, if it has one, isn't simply about disease. It's about humility. For all our confidence, we are still living in a biological house we don't entirely own. Every few generations, the landlord knocks on the door to remind us, and when that knock comes, the sound is familiar. It's the same rhythm the world heard more than a century ago, muffled through masks and memory. The same breath, the same whisper, the reminder that control is temporary, and that the quietest killers are the ones we stop listening to. A century after the first coughs in Haskell County, the echoes still ripple. The 1918 influenza pandemic belongs to a world of sepia photographs and telegrams, yet its fingerprints remain on the pulse of the modern one. Every hospital protocol, every vaccine campaign, every global alert owes something to that invisible teacher that spoke in fevers and silence. It's a ghost woven into modernity's bloodstream, too small to see, too old to forget. When historians talk about the Spanish flu today, they do so with a tone that is both reverent and bewildered. The numbers are vast, but numbers are poor storytellers. 50 million deaths is a statistic until you imagine a single street corner emptied of familiar faces. In 1918, those absences multiplied until they became the air itself. The pandemic didn't just take lives, it rearranged time. It erased the continuity of families, interrupted generations, and forced the living to rebuild the narrative of normal life from fragments. But perhaps the most haunting part of the story isn't the death toll or the medical failure. It's how quickly the world healed on the surface, at least. Within a year, music returned, Cinemas reopened and headlines turned to economics and politics. There was no long public mourning, no national conversation about collective trauma. People simply folded the memory away, as if storing it in a drawer, labeled "Do Not Open." Yet, even sealed away, it influenced everything that came after. The silence itself became its monument. That silence taught doctors to document everything. It taught bureaucrats to count. It taught nations to create health ministries and to watch for patterns. Out of despair came data, and out of data came prevention. The transformation was quiet, but total. The age of intuition gave way to the age of evidence. Medicine began to quantify life, to predict illness before it arrived. Humanity had learned that ignorance was fatal, and that the smallest things required the greatest attention. And yet, each generation had to rediscover the lesson on its own. The 1957 and 1968 pandemics reminded the post-war world that comfort doesn't equal safety. The 2009 flu reminded the digital age that information travels faster than immunity. And the pandemic of the 2020s, one that arrived exactly a century after the first, proved that technology cannot outpace biology. Despite satellites, algorithms, and instant communication, the same patterns re-emerged. Denial, fear, blame, fatigue, a century of progress, and still the same choreography, just played in brighter colors and sharper focus. It's easy to feel discouraged by that repetition, but history's comfort lies in its rhythm. Each time, humanity survives. Not unscarred, not unchanged, but intact enough to rebuild. The 1918 flu was not the end of the world, though to those who lived through it, it surely felt like it. It was simply another reminder that resilience is quieter than panic. People endured by doing small things, nursing the sick, keeping diaries, lighting candles, and reopening shops. Survival, it turned out, was mundane work. There's an understated beauty in how the 1918 pandemic shaped empathy. The experience of isolation, fear, and helplessness made people reconsider what connected them. They realized that disease didn't care about borders, classes, or ideologies. For all the cruelty it unleashed, the flu was also a brief, brutal equalizer. Monarchs and miners, poets and soldiers, all gasped for the same breath. That shared vulnerability planted the idea that health is a collective endeavor, public good, not private luck. Modern public health campaigns still speak in that language, even if they don't remember where it came from. Wash your hands, cover your cough, get vaccinated. Simple phrases, repeated endlessly, built on the bones of a forgotten century. They sound mundane now, but they were once revolutionary, small rituals of defiance against chaos. Every instruction printed on a bottle of disinfectant is, in its way, an echo of 1918's panic, translated into calm procedure. If you look closely, you can see the ghost everywhere, in the open windows of crowded classrooms, in the sterile smell of hospitals, in the way people flinch when someone coughs in public, in the quiet expectation that governments should act when illness spreads. The pandemic changed what civilization considers normal. It taught the world to see the invisible and to design against it. The 1918 influenza also changed how scientists understood time itself. Before it, pandemics were seen as singular events, acts of fate. Afterward, they became cycles to be studied, predicted, perhaps even interrupted. The modern flu vaccine, updated each year, is an acknowledgement that history never truly ends. It just mutates. Each injection is a kind of truce, a reminder that the battle is ongoing, but manageable. It's as if the descendants of that long-dead virus and the descendants of its survivors have agreed to coexist, each keeping the other in check. What remains most poignant, perhaps, is the way memory and biology intertwine. The grandchildren of 1918 survivors carry antibodies and genes shaped by that experience. Their immune systems bear the faint signature of that confrontation, an inherited whisper of resilience. In that sense, the pandemic didn't just kill, it edited humanity. Every cell that learned to recognize a flu virus became a tiny archive of survival. And so, the story continues, muted, cyclical, patient. The silent killer didn't vanish, it adapted, and so did we. The balance between fear and progress, between remembering and forgetting, remains delicate. The real triumph of 1918 wasn't the eventual vaccine or the scientific breakthroughs. It was the realization that humility and endurance are the only permanent defenses we have. In the end, the 1918 flu is less a tragedy than a parable. It's a reminder that control is an illusion, that cooperation is fragile, and that resilience often looks like routine. It shows that the smallest things, a sneeze, a cough, a single breath, can rewrite civilizations, and it leaves us with a strange comfort. If humanity survived that, it can survive almost anything. So the world goes on, carrying the faint hum of that old catastrophe in its veins. Cities rise, children laugh, and laboratories quietly watch the skies for the next sign of mutation. The silent killer has learned to whisper, and humanity, finally, has learned to listen, if only in moments of stillness, when the air feels heavy and history seems to hold its breath.